In today's video, we'll be looking at Appeasement and the War Begins. The world stood still in an uneasy peace, hoping to never go down the road of war again. This apathy towards war and conflict led the major powers of the world to do nothing as a handful of dictators rose to power in the world. The world unknowingly stood at the edge of destiny, able to prevent the worst conflict in human history, but unwilling to take action. This moment in history reminds us of an important lesson. Quote, "All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." And that's kind of where we're going to start off today with this concept of appeasement, which is giving in to the demands of an aggressor in order to achieve peace. And I liken this to a parent in the toy aisle of a store, in which her child is crying and wanting a toy, and instead of disciplining the child and saying no, they give in order to calm the child down and keep the child from crying and making a scene. They're basically appeasing the child. So that's what we kind of mean when we're talking about giving in to the demands of an aggressor to achieve peace. Case in point, in 1935, Hitler fulfills his promise to rebuild Germany's armed forces when he increases their troops from 100,000 to 600,000 and begins to build an air force, both of which are in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. But after this is found out, nothing is done about it. Now basically, they appease Hitler. Well, let him build his army, let him build his air force. As long as we're not going to war, as long as this maintains peace, it's okay. In 1936, Germany reoccupies the Rhineland, an area that was supposed to be demilitarized without weapons or fortification. But because it was technically German land, the French had been occupying it for a long time following World War I to help pay those reparations because it was a fairly industrial part of Germany. The fact that Germany comes in and reoccupies it, many stand back and say, well, it's German land. Germany's only trying to reoccupy its own land. That's okay. But yet it violated treaty and nothing was done about it. And it's not just Germany that's starting to become aggressive. In 1937, Japan invades China, hoping to one day team up with the Germans and have a joint attack or assault on the Soviet Union. And again, nothing is done about this. The United States puts on a little bit of economic pressure and starts to restrict some of the trade that it's giving Japan, but there's no aggressive response to these aggressive invasions of other countries. Back in Germany in 1938, Germany annexes Austria. Annexing meaning basically they merge with or take on Austria. Now, Austria held elections in their country, some might say fraudulent elections, but in the end, the Nazis rise to power in Austria and request that Germany take them over, which it does. Soon after, in Hitler's pursuit to unite all the German-speaking people, he starts to make demands of the Sudetenland, which is the western province of Czechoslovakia. He says, "I want this land or else there would be war." And Czechoslovakia refuses. And so the major powers, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, kind of all meet together to discuss what should happen to the Sudetenland. What will be the fate of the Sudetenland? Because Hitler's threatening war with Czechoslovakia, to help unite the German-speaking people, thinking that the Germans in this area are being mistreated and not fairly represented. They need to be part of Germany, and we want to take them over. And so the major nations come together, and it was decided that the Sudetenland should be turned over. Again, Hitler is appeased. The other nations gave in to his demands, this aggressive demands, in order to maintain peace. Now, many nations believe that war had been avoided. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, that you see there, arrives back into London claiming, quote, "peace for our time." He believes that this was a good thing and gets off the plane and makes this wonderful speech about how this is a good thing for Britain and the world.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains. but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
So again, people are very joyous. They think this is a good thing. But in the following year, in March, Germany ends up invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. And soon after taking over the rest of Czechoslovakia, Hitler begins to make demands of a port in Poland, the free city of Danzig, Poland, both of which were protected by Britain and France. But if you look at the map there where Poland and Danzig are, while Britain and France can say all they want to that they're protecting these two areas, there's not much they can do about it if Germany were to invade those areas. Britain and France are over here on the west, it's over here on the east. There's nothing they can do in time to save Poland or Danzig if Germany invaded. Britain and France look and see the only power in the east strong enough to take on the Germans was the Soviets. And so they begin talks with Stalin. And again, Hitler is not a stupid man either. He also realizes the only person on his eastern side, or his eastern front, that could challenge him is the Soviets. He also begins talks with Stalin. And in August of 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact. Essentially, they won't attack each other. The Soviet Union is not going to be involved in any kind of aggressive act towards Germany. And many people were surprised by this. The idea that fascist Germany and communist Soviet Union actually can come to an agreement and get along with each other was shocking. But it happened. But many still wondered, how long is this little honeymoon going to last between Germany and Russia? They shouldn't be getting along with each other, but they are. And not only are they getting along, they're starting an agreement here. Not only are they saying they won't attack each other, they also secretly agree that when Germany invades Poland, which it's planning on doing, the Soviet Union is going to invade from the east, and they're going to meet in the middle and split this territory between them. So, with nothing stopping him on his eastern border, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, and just as the agreement was, the Soviet Union invades the rest. Following this aggressive act, Britain and France do declare war on Germany. World War II has begun. Also at the beginning of World War II, the Tripartite Pact combines the military goals of Germany, Italy, and Japan, eventually forming the Axis powers there. Now, Germany will be very, very successful at the very beginning of World War II, mainly because of a new military tactic called Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. It's a German military tactic in which you combine tanks and ground forces supported by airplanes to quickly defeat your enemy. How this simply works is planes will come in and bomb the area that you're wanting to attack, take out many of the major obstacles that will be in your way. Next comes the tanks to kind of mop up anything left, any other major targets that the planes didn't get, and those tanks are going to be supported by ground forces to protect the tanks and take out any small resistance that's still left. Using this tactic, Germany is able to conquer a lot of territory early on in the war. In April of 1940, the Nazis invade Denmark and Norway. The following month in May, the Nazis invade the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, taking them out. And then in June, the Germans are able to do something they weren't able to do during World War I, which is conquer France. France falls in less than 6 weeks when the Germans go around the French defensive fortification known as the Maginot Line and go through Belgium once again and invade northern France and conquer it this time. Now they only conquer northern France. Southern France will be controlled by a pro-Nazi puppet government known as Vichy France. But in essence, all of France is conquered at this point. Meanwhile, poor reaction from Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to the war, because the British did send an army to help the French, and that army almost got surrounded and conquered by the Nazis early on in the war, and by some miracle, known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, the British army is able to retreat across the English Channel back into Britain and not be taken over by the Nazis. So Neville Chamberlain's poor leadership forces him to resign, and he is replaced by Winston Churchill, probably one of the best-known British prime ministers in all of British history. But Hitler feared that Britain would not lay idly by as Germany continued to conquer parts of Europe, and made plans to invade Britain, known as Operation Sea Lion. So this takes place in 1940, in August of 1940. The Nazis attempt, again in Operation Sea Lion, to invade Britain by defeating the RAF, the Royal Air Force. Hitler realized that if he wanted to take out Britain, wanted to invade Britain, he would have to first take out their Air Force. There's no sense in sailing across to Britain while your ships are getting bombarded by the British Air Force. So you have to take out the Air Force before you could land troops in Britain. And this becomes known as the Battle of Britain. But it eventually fails. The German Air Force, known as the Luftwaffe, were unsuccessful due to Britain's new radar technology that allowed them to detect incoming planes. So after a while, Hitler changes his strategy from bombing the airfields to actually, for the first time in war, bombing civilian targets. He begins to tell his Luftwaffe at night to bomb cities, British cities like London. This allowed the British Air Force to recover their airfields and be able to, again, mount a resistance to the German Luftwaffe. So that within a month, Hitler calls off the invasion of Britain. But this is the first major battle fought entirely by Air Force, and lasted for about a month. Then in the following year, Hitler portrays Stalin, stabs him in the back, essentially. You see from the cartoon there where Hitler says, "Forgive me, comrade," but it seems like such a good opportunity as Stalin is dropping that Russo-German pact that they had, because Hitler decides to invade the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. Earlier that year in the spring, Hitler had also invaded Southeast Europe, taking out Yugoslavia and Greece. So you can see by the end of 1941, Hitler has conquered most of Europe. But by December of 1941, the United States enters the war after the Japanese sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. And a few days later, the Germans decide to declare war on the United States as well. So now the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union are now working together to resist and fight off the Nazis. In November of the following year, in 1942, the British are able to hold off the German advance in Egypt in a battle known as the Battle of El Alamein. Here the British push the Germans back across Africa against the incoming U.S. troops in Africa, known as Operation Torch. And eventually by 1943, the Germans are pushed out of Africa as the Allies look to invade Italy that same year. Now also in November of 1942, we have the largest battle to take place during World War II, and possibly the largest battle in history. And that's when the Germans decide to advance on Stalingrad. Here the Soviets hold off the German advance of Soviet oil fields. Hitler had tried to go through Egypt to get to the rich oil fields of the Middle East. That didn't work. So now he's trying to go through the Soviet Union, and that also doesn't work. Even though the Soviets lost 2 million men in the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans lost 230,000. They lost an entire army trying to take this city, but it doesn't work. It's a lost cause for the Germans and becomes a turning point of the war. And what we mean by a turning point is up until this point, the Germans have been advancing, and no one's really been able to stop the German war machine here until the Battle of Stalingrad. After the Battle of Stalingrad and Hitler losing that entire army, the 6th Army, I believe, after the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviets will begin an offensive drive to push the Germans back to Berlin. At the same time, the British and the United States are coming up from the south into Italy. So things are starting to turn around here, but it begins at Stalingrad. And another thing to note here is that the Soviets are standing strong on the Eastern Front. They have not let it fall. And this is important because if you'll remember in World War I, the Russians pulled out of the war near the end, allowing the Germans to basically concentrate on their Western Front. But here during World War II, that's not possible. The Soviets are holding strong, and they are not giving up the Eastern Front. Now, in the following year, in 1943, two conferences are held by Allied leaders that will determine the outcome of this war. The first one takes place in January, known as the Casablanca Conference. Here, the United States and the British agreed to unconditional surrender for all enemies. What that means is this war is going to end one way. The Germans and the Japanese have to surrender. They can't make any conditions. They can't say, we'll give up if you let us keep Poland, because that's a condition. This is an unconditional surrender. You have to basically give up and say whatever happens to us, happens to us. The second conference takes place in November, known as the Tehran Conference. This is the first meeting of the Big Three, the three major leaders of the Allied forces, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, that you see sitting there respectively. And it's at this conference that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill agreed to open up a Western Front. Because up until this point, it's been mostly aerial battles going on the Western Front. And under great pressure from Stalin to get in the game, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to it. And again, Stalin has a lot of reason to pressure them. He just came from the Battle of Stalingrad, in which he lost 2 million soldiers. His guys are the ones that are bleeding on the battlefield fighting the Nazis on ground battles, army against army. The British and the Americans haven't done that yet. And he's saying, you guys have got to get in the game. You guys have got to open up a Western Front and take some of the pressure off of me here in the East. So the following year, in 1944, on June 6th, Operation Overlord commences. Essentially, it's the invasion of Normandy, better known as D-Day. This invasion takes place where 160,000 Allied troops invade Nazi-occupied France across the English Channel from Britain. There were 5 major waves, 2 led by the United States, in which they invaded 2 beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha. The British took codenames Gold and Sword, and the Canadians actually landed here and codenamed their beach Juno. Now, of those 5 beaches, it was Omaha that had the most resistance from the Germans. But in the end, this would be the largest amphibious invasion in history. And what we mean by amphibious invasion is that the invasion comes from water to land. So this is the largest amphibious invasion in history. And also, a Western Front is finally established. The British and the Americans have a foothold in mainland Europe, and soon begin to push the Nazis back out of France. Now, by December of 1944, the Germans try one last attempt to push the Allies back, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Now, this battle is officially known as the Battle of Ardennes in 1944. And the reason it's called the Battle of the Bulge is because the Germans are able to push the Allies back temporarily, forming a bulge there, but it fails. The German war machine is running out of fuel, literally. At the end of this battle, there are stories of German tanks just left there on the side of the road because they had literally ran out of fuel. And so it's becoming pretty obvious that the German war machine is coming to an end. In the following year, in 1945, another conference is held, known as the Yalta Conference. It's held between the Big Three yet again over what's going to happen to Germany when this war is over. We saw what happened to Germany the last time, after World War I, when we tried to punish them. We see how well that worked. What are we going to do this time? How will we deal with Germany at the end of this war? And it's decided that Germany will be divided into 4 sections, controlled by 4 Allied leaders: the British, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets. But by May 8th, 1945, the Germans finally surrender, and this becomes known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe. The war in Europe was over. The worst war in human history had finally come to an end, nearly 6 years after it had begun. In that time, the war had taken between 45 and 50 million lives in Europe alone and left the major cities of Europe in shambles. But the war was not over. The Allies now looked to the continuing conflict in the Pacific against the Japanese Empire and decided they too must surrender or face utter destruction.